Hi, hello, my name is Gomer Joseph. I hope you've all been having a great day so far. Every Tuesday, I cover true crime cases, so if you'd like to see more videos from me, feel free to subscribe. If you find yourself liking this video by the end, feel free to hit the like button. Today's case has truly disturbed me. If you're easily sickened by certain subjects, I'm advising you to watch this video with caution. As you can tell by the title, I'll be talking about Jeffrey Dahmer, who was this demonic, gruesome, sick serial killer. I'm gonna try my best not to, go into much detail about how gruesome his murders were, but as I did research on this story, I was thrown back at how insane this case truly is. Now, I've always known that Dahmer was this sick serial killer, like every serial killer is, but I would never really look into this case like that until now. This whole story is insane. It's filled with certain twists and turns and even caused me to get emotional at times. Here we go. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the firstborn child of Joyce and Lionel Dahmer. After Jeffrey's birth, his mother was having a hard time bonding with her baby. The reason for that was postpartum depression. Back at the time that Jeffrey was a baby, it wasn't treated like it is now, which meant that those around her most likely thought she'd get over it, instead of getting Joyce the help she needed. Not only was she dealing with postpartum, but with Jeffrey's father Lionel being a college student studying chemistry, he didn't have much time to spend with his family. Earlier on, Jeffrey was this energetic and happy child. Right before the time Jeffrey reached 4, he had double hernia surgery. For some reason, his personality changed afterward. Now, I'm no doctor, but my guess is that having this surgery at an early age probably messed with his personality. Again, there's nothing factual about this, it's only my opinion. Jeffrey became withdrawn and was terrified of meeting new people. One example of this is when he was in first grade and his teacher noticed how all the other kids were playing around during recess, but Jeffrey would pace back and forth. Not only did Jeffrey have to deal with this social awkwardness, but it seemed like his parents were fighting constantly. With all of this drama going on at home, Jeffrey was fascinated with dead animals. He was more interested in dissecting them instead of killing them. His father Lionel would later on explain how he thought it was just him being a curious little boy. By the time Jeffrey was 5, his family moved to Doylestown, Ohio, and his mother gave birth to his younger brother David, who Jeffrey actually named himself. Sometime after 1970 hit, Jeffrey's mother Joyce was hospitalized twice. This woman used drugs to deal with her extreme nervousness. Once again, she was medicating herself while her own postpartum probably hadn't even been treated. So this lady was dealing with some extreme personal issues. Jeffrey also became a teenager and he was more isolated. He was also known as this weird goofball. People at his school would see him do these weird pranks of him shouting out words randomly and would fake epileptic fits. I guess not too many kids saw that as something serious, like they probably thought he was just trying to be some class clown. Despite what was going on in the outside, Jeffrey still faced inner battles. Jeffrey pretty much became an alcoholic and he used alcohol as a way to overcome his homicidal and sexual urges. The sexual urges he had were homosexual, and especially since it was in the 70s, he was terrified that if his family found out, they would shun him. At the age of 14, he planned his first attack on a male jogger. He saw this jogger almost every day and had a crush on him. Of course, this was chilling, especially having those thoughts in your head that young. The plan was to jump from the bushes and beat him with a baseball bat. Praise God, the jogger didn't show up that day because Jeffrey gave up on the whole plan altogether. In 1978, Jeffrey graduated high school. While it was supposed to be this time of celebration and anticipation for the future, his parents divorced. After the divorce, Jeffrey's parents and his brother left the house, leaving him the only one living there, which he was able to since he was 18. Many people his age would have found this as this great sense of freedom. Instead, being alone made Jeffrey, feel lonely. With this loneliness, it only increased these morbid fantasies of his. Not long after he had the house to himself, Jeffrey was driving towards some liquor store on June 18, 1978. As he was driving, he spotted this hitchhiker. The name of the hitchhiker was Stephen Hicks, who was an 18-year-old on his way to some rock concert. After Jeffrey stopped by to talk to Stephen, he was invited to go to the Dahmer house to drink beer. Hicks accepted the offer, then got into the vehicle. After the two consumed alcohol, Stephen was getting ready to leave. Again, his plan was to attend some rock concert that day. As this guy wanted to go, Jeffrey tried to persuade him to stay a little, longer. Slowly, this disagreement became physical, and Stephen was able to fight off Jeffrey. Once Stephen made it to the door, he was hit in the back of the head with a 10-pound weight, which knocked him out. Unfortunately, Dahmer didn't stop there. He strangled Stephen with a weight until he died, making Stephen Hicks his first victim. While Dahmer looked over this dead body, he didn't even panic. Instead, he just fulfilled his sexual desires. Eventually, the body was placed in the bathtub, and it took Dahmer hours to dissect the body. After the body was dissected, some remains were flushed in the toilet. Then the rest were buried in the forest, which was around Dahmer house. So no one would have seen Dahmer do any of this. Basically, Dahmer was living like this murder never occurred, then enrolled in Ohio State University, but didn't stay long since he didn't return the following semester. Around this time, Dahmer's father, Lionel, remarried a woman named Sherry, and there wasn't really much I could find about Dahmer's reaction to this new marriage. I couldn't find out if he did or didn't approve of this marriage. I'm just not sure. In 1979, he joined the Army as a medical specialist. At first, he had this great start doing everything he was supposed to do. Unfortunately, alcohol was back in his life, which changed his performance in a negative way. He was later moved to Germany, where two fellow soldiers later admitted that they were drugged and raped by him, which completely angers me. There are two people who wanted to serve and protect the American people, but were assaulted by one of their own. Since Dahmer's problem with alcohol continued to, have an effect on his service, he was discharged in 1981 with an honorable discharge. I've never been in the military, but I do know people in the military, and I can ask them about this, but I'm not sure if being an alcoholic should allow someone to have an honorable discharge, since having a drinking problem isn't honorable at all. Not only that, he raped two other people in the military, but no one knew since it wasn't reported at the time. But I just can't believe he still got this honorable discharge. After being discharged from the military, he was too ashamed to contact his parents. So instead of going back home, he traveled to Miami Beach, Florida. During his time there, he rented a motel room, but the money he had on him was mostly spent on alcohol. Since most of the money was spent on liquor, he wasn't able to pay at the motel, which caused him to get evicted. So after his eviction, he was forced to move back to Ohio and face his family. After he got back home, he was arrested for being drunk and disorderly in public. Because of this arrest, I would assume that Dahmer's parents felt like it would be best for him to stay with his grandmother in West Allis, Milwaukee, to pretty much get his life together. As soon as he moved back into his grandmother's house, he was helping around the house and looked for work for his own. So eventually he found a job as I hope I can say this right, phlebotomist? I think I completely butchered what it was. But he worked as this thing at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center. 10 months later, he was laid off. Things only got worse for Dahmer because he was later arrested for indecent exposure at a state fair in front of women and children. I'm surprised that his grandmother still let him live at her house, but she did, and he was still unemployed for 2 years. So later on in 1985, he was hired as a mixer at the Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. At this time, he continued reading pornography since, he started in 1981. Not only that, but he was also attending gay bars. He didn't just want to go to these places to meet other guys, but his main goal was to have this control over them, which was why he began drugging other men. So Dahmer even considered digging up the grave of an 18-year-old at the time who recently passed away. What stopped him was that he got tired of digging, then, stopped. Once again, Dahmer was arrested in 1986 for masturbating in front of two 12-year-old boys. Because of this unusual and disturbing crime, he was sentenced to 1-year probation. On September 15, 1987, Dahmer was on one of his trips to the gay bar when he met 25-year-old Steve, I want to say his last name right, Tuwami. Dahmer brought Steve over to the Ambassador Hotel. The plan was to drug and rape him. Instead, Dahmer claims that the next thing he remembered was seeing Steve's dead body beaten and bruised. So Dahmer's knuckles were bruised as well, so he claimed to have blacked out when he beat this man to death. Not only does this murder not only does it creep me out, but it really creeps me out how Dahmer's first two victims' names were Steven. And I'm pretty sure he didn't even mean for that to even happen as well. What's crazy is that Dahmer wasn't even concerned that this guy was dead in the hotel room. His main concern was disposing the body, and it was going to be difficult since the man died in a hotel room filled with other people. Dahmer left his hotel room, bought a suitcase, went back into the room, and stuffed the body in the suitcase. After leaving the hotel with the suitcase in his hand, Dahmer got into a cab back to his grandmother's house. Unfortunately, Dahmer didn't even leave the body alone. He raped the corpse, then dissected the body. Some parts were flushed into the toilet, then saved the head and other parts of the body in this concealed box. When his father came to visit the house, Lionel felt like it was sketchy that his box was locked, and Dahmer wouldn't reveal what was in it. Lionel began to demand his son to tell him what was kept inside, but instead an argument broke out, so Lionel basically decided to leave it alone and forget about it. Later on, Lionel would admit how he wished he would have just decided to crack the box open. Because of the murder of Stephen Tuwami, it fueled Dahmer to kill again. You might be wondering why he wasn't fueled to kill again after the death of his first victim, Stephen Hicks. Dahmer would later explain how he had those urges to kill in between that time, but he kept himself busy. He went to college, joined the military, traveled to different places, had different jobs. Doing all that stuff pretty much calmed him down with those demonic fantasies of his. Because of this urge to kill, he came across this 14-year-old Native American named James Doxator, I think that's how you say his last name, while he was on his way to a gay bar on January 16th, 1988. Believe it or not, folks, January 16th is my birthday. Now, I was born in 97, but it's still creepy that what I'm about to say occurred on the 16th of January. Not only was this kid 14 years old, but he was also a prostitute. Dahmer was able to convince this kid to go back with him to his grandmother's house by offering $50 to take naked pictures. Dahmer did what he did to this child at his grandmother's house, then drugged and strangled James to death. Which absolutely does break my heart. This 14-year-old seemed like he didn't even have a chance. As to feel like he had to prostitute himself and eventually get killed by someone like Dahmer is just a sad way for such a young life to end. Dahmer left the body in the cellar for a week, cut the body, then placed it in the trash. Afterward, he boiled the head. On March 24th, 1988, Dahmer met 22-year-old Richard Guerrero outside of a gay bar. Once again, the offer was $50, but this time it was to spend the night. At the grandmother's house, Guerrero was drugged with sleeping pills. He was also strangled with a leather belt, then Dahmer raped the body. He kept the head but got rid of the remains. Some were flushed, while others were thrown away in the trash. On April 23, 1988, Dahmer brought Roland Flowers to his grandmother's house. Sometime after Roland Flowers was drugged, Dahmer's grandmother actually did wake up. As she was awake, she told her grandson how she didn't want any visitors in the house. Of course, while she woke up, she didn't see Roland in the house at all. She and Dahmer were in separate rooms as they communicated with each other. But this situation just gives me the chills too, because that would have meant she was completely asleep as her grandson killed two other people under her roof, right under her nose. Flowers' life was spared by the grace of God, so Dahmer dropped Flowers off at a hospital. As Roland was beginning to get his mind straight, he reported Dahmer to the police and wanted him to be charged with assault. Instead, no one believed him because of his intoxicated state. After hearing that, I'm aggravated that the police didn't take it seriously, but I guess I could understand a little how his intoxicated state would raise some doubts. I just wish he could have still done his best to report Dahmer, but what's done is done. After this incident with Roland Flowers, Dahmer's grandmother came to the decision to kick him out. She was pretty much fed up with the men he was bringing into the house and how he allowed the basement to stink up. Of course, she was oblivious that those men were killed and that the basement began to stink because of their dead bodies. Dahmer found an apartment to live in, and it didn't take long for him to find this 13-year-old boy. He offered the boy $50 if he took nude pics. At the apartment, Dahmer would later drug the child after the kid drank from the spiked drink. By the grace of God, the kid was able to get away. As he escaped the apartment, he did become sick. His parents took him to the hospital, and this kid had to get his stomach pumped. Dahmer was later arrested for assaulting this child. When the charge was suspended for some reason, Dahmer was forced to move out of his apartment to live with his grandmother again. And once again, I'm surprised that she let him back in, because I'm sure she'd had to have known that her grandson was charged for basically molesting a child. Despite this charge hovering over Dahmer's head, he met with 24-year-old Anthony Sears on March 25th, 1989. Anthony was an inspiring model that Dahmer met at a gay bar. They did what they did to each other, but Anthony was drugged, then strangled after this sexual interaction. After Anthony's death, he was chopped up in the grandmother's bathtub. Dahmer decided to preserve the body parts, but stored them in his work locker. Yes, Dahmer was so far gone that when he killed his first victim, but seems like he didn't see that he was messed up when he brought Anthony Sears' remains to his job. 2 months after the murder of Anthony Sears, Dahmer was sentenced to 2 years probation and 1 year in a correctional facility. He was surprisingly able to keep his job, but was forced to be on the sex offenders list, which causes me to question why he wasn't on the sex offenders list when he masturbated in front of 2 minors prior to this crime. But what's done is done. He was released early because he was no longer a threat to the community. As we all know, that was completely false. Dahmer eventually moved out of his grandmother's house again, then moved to another apartment, which was in a majority black neighborhood, in apartment 213. Because he got his own place, Dahmer moved Anthony Sears' remains from his work locker to his new apartment. Neighbors would later on explain how introverted Dahmer was. On May 20th, 1990, Dahmer met with 32-year-old Raymond Smith, who was also a prostitute who went by the name of Ricky Beeks. Dahmer offered him the usual $50 to have sex with him. Arriving to the apartment, Dahmer slipped 7 sleeping pills in Raymond's drink, then strangled the man. After he took pictures of the dead body, dismembered in the bathroom, then boiled the arms and legs for some reason, the skull was placed next to Anthony Sears' skull. There was this man he did try to kill after Raymond's death. What Dahmer did was that he accidentally drugged himself. The joke was on Dahmer that night, especially when the man he wanted to kill robbed him. On June 14th, 1990, Dahmer invited 36-year-old Eddie Smith to his apartment. Eddie was known as this kind-hearted and loving guy. Now, unlike the previous victims, Eddie and Dahmer actually knew each other. In the previous murders, it's so easy for me to say how they should have never gone to a stranger's house in the first place. What am I supposed to say in this situation? Like, these 2 men knew each other, which was so terrifying. Like, you don't expect someone you know to be a serial killer. So it wouldn't have been weird for Eddie to go to Dahmer's apartment when he was invited. Sadly, Eddie was eventually drugged, strangled, then dismembered. Dahmer tried to freeze the head, then tried drying it up in the oven. Just thinking about that, like, how in the world did Dahmer think that was going to turn out. Like, after the skull was placed in the oven, it exploded. This made Dahmer angry because he didn't have anything of the body left. Yet, it didn't anger him that he took this man's life. Y'all might be wondering, like, why did he want to keep these body parts in the first place? Later on, Dahmer would explain how he wanted to keep the body parts so that these people he killed would never leave him. That's his reason, but it doesn't make it a good reason at all. On September 2nd, 1990, Dahmer met 22-year-old Ernest Miller at a bookstore. Ernest was invited to go to the apartment, but when Dahmer realized there weren't enough drugs to knock this guy out, the lack of drugs didn't stop him. Because of the lack of drugs, Ernest began to wake up, which began to make Dahmer panic. Since things didn't go Dahmer's way, he stabbed the man to death, took pictures of the corpse, then raped the corpse. Obviously, doing all of this was evil and weird enough, but Dahmer talked to the dead body as he was cutting it in pieces. The body parts were left in the fridge so that Dahmer could eat them later. Like, guys, he didn't even eat the bodies because he thought the parts looked tasty. He would later explain, like how the other body parts, he wanted to make sure his victims stayed with him permanently. Again, that's his reason, but it's obviously not a good reason. The skull was later placed in Dahmer's closet. On September 24th, 1990, while Dahmer was at a mall, he met with 23-year-old David Thomas, who was the father of 2 children. When Dahmer convinced David to come to the apartment, he drugged the man. Unlike his other victims, Dahmer wasn't attracted to David, yet he decided to strangle the man to death anyways. The body parts were cut, and Dahmer considered it a waste. Like, guys, so far, everything Dahmer has done has completely blown my mind in a terrible, terrible way. But he talked about a human being as if he was a spoiled piece of candy, which infuriates me. Since Dahmer wasn't able to kill another 5 months, he became disappointed. Near Marquette University, Dahmer met 17-year-old Curtis Straughter on February 18th, 1991. Straughter went to Dahmer's apartment because he was offered money, but was eventually drugged, then strangled. His head was also placed in a fridge. On April 7th, 1991, 19-year-old Errol Lindsay met Dahmer and was invited to the apartment. Unlike his previous victims, Errol was the first victim where Dahmer would drill a hole in the man's head, then pour hydrochloric acid in the brain. Those who aren't familiar with this case might be wondering why Dahmer wanted to drill a human being's head, then fill the brain up with acid. Like I mentioned before, Dahmer wanted to control his victims. He thought if he could drill the brain and pour acid, it would make his victims a zombie. For those who know me personally, you know that I'm not a science expert at all. But I doubt that would have been humanly possible for Dahmer to do that. So for the life of me, I can't understand why he even tried. Errol surprisingly woke up, but he did have a headache, which caused him to collapse. Dahmer drugged the man, strangled him to death, then cut the body and kept the skull. As these murders were taking place, Dahmer's neighbors began to complain about the smell in the apartment and the strange noises that they would hear. Anthony Tony Hughes was another person who Dahmer knew. He was a 31-year-old who was deaf and mute. Dahmer invited this guy to hang out at the apartment on May 24th, 1991. Tony was drugged, Dahmer drilled a hole in his skull, injected acid, and it did kill Tony immediately. But Dahmer never intended to kill Tony. Dahmer kept the skull, but left the body to rot on the bathroom floor this time. After Tony's death, Dahmer would roam the streets looking for his next victim, which is when he came across 14-year-old Conrad. I feel like I'm about to go ahead and butcher this child's last name. I want to say his last name is Cynthia Somphony. Dahmer offered the kid $50 to come to his apartment. When arriving at the apartment, the teen was drugged, assaulted, then Dahmer drilled the hole in the head and injected it with acid. The child did wake up and leave the apartment when Dahmer left him in the room alone, since this child barely had any clothes on and was barely able to stand, with blood coming out of his butt. It caught the attention of 3 women in the neighborhood. For those of you who haven't done research on this case for yourself, what I'm about to say about this kid will completely blow you away. Konarak is actually the brother of the 13-year-old boy who Dahmer assaulted and was arrested for, the assault. This completely surprised me, and I don't really want to make it sound like I'm blaming Konarak at all. Like, Dahmer is the one to blame. He was the adult, and he knew exactly what he was doing. Konarak didn't recognize Dahmer at all. If he did, I'm sure he wouldn't have even gotten close to the man. But I wish he wouldn't have agreed to have gone to a stranger's house after what he knew about what happened to his brother. We can't go back in time to change all of this, but I really wish there would have been such a better outcome. As the 3 women attempted to help Konarak by calling the police, Dahmer looked for him by the time he realized the teen left the apartment. Dahmer lied to the police, claiming Konarak was his 19-year-old lover named John, who was only drunk. This is the part which infuriates me, and this whole story already infuriates me enough. The police brought the story. Like, no matter what state Konarak was in, no matter where the blood was coming from, they still allowed him to go with Dahmer. Like, looking at the picture of Konarak, he didn't even look 19. Like, even the 3 women knew that was a child, but the police still allowed the teen to go back with Dahmer. Back at the apartment, Tommy's body was still on the floor. Dahmer finished the teen off by injecting more acid, which ended up killing the boy. Like, his death, it could have completely been prevented, and it's so sad. Like, Tony's body was later cut up, and so was Konarak's. Okay, so I'm in the middle of editing right now, and I realized I forgot to mention how the mother of the 3 women who saw Konarak that night, she later saw, the story of the missing boy who was Konarak on the newspaper. She did call the police, but unfortunately there was no follow-up for some reason. Like, when there's a missing child and somebody has this type of information, even if it's nothing like it's still great, it's still, like, smart for someone to check up on it, because you don't know if this person actually has some solid information or not. Because of the constant complaints from his neighbor, Dahmer brought this 57-gallon drone filled with acid as a way to kill the smell. I'm gonna guess Dahmer got bored with killing people in his state because he decided to travel 2 hours away to Chicago and met up with a 20-year-old named Matt Turner on June 30th, 1991. Matt was described as this outgoing guy who had a great social life. He traveled on the bus to Dahmer's apartment, but was eventually drugged, strangled, then dismembered. This time, Dahmer placed the body in the gallon where it dissolved, but kept the skull. Dahmer traveled back to Chicago again and met 23-year-old Jeremy, I want to say his last name right, Weinberger, who worked as a customer service rep. Jeremy asked his friend of what he thought about Dahmer. Since Dahmer did seem like a normal guy to people, Jeremy's friend thought that Dahmer seemed like a decent guy. After spending several days at this apartment, Dahmer convinced Jeremy to take a drink, which is actually filled with drugs. Since Jeremy was drugged, his skull was drilled in, then injected with boiling water. Jeremy did wake up without feeling tired or anything like that, but was drugged once again with another injection of boiling water. After a 2-day coma, Jeremy did pass away. Then Dahmer placed his body in the gallon so that the acid could dissolve the body, and place the head in the freezer. But, again, like, after, the information about Jeremy came out, his friend felt so guilty, he actually ended up killing himself, which the friend shouldn't have been feeling guilty at all, because he wasn't the one who killed Dahmer. Like, Dahmer seemed like this normal guy to them, and there was no type of alarms ringing off. But, again, Jeremy's friend, he shouldn't have been blaming himself and it's said that he killed himself out of guilt. On July 15th, 1991, Dahmer offered 23-year-old aspiring bodybuilder Oliver Lacey money to take pictures in the apartment. At the time, Oliver recently moved to Illinois with his girlfriend and child. At the apartment, Oliver was drugged, strangled, raped, then dismembered. His head was also placed in the freezer next to baking soda so that it could hide the smell. Dahmer would keep other body parts to consume later on. Since Dahmer was out here killing people, it negatively impacted the work he had at his job. Because of his poor performance, it led to him getting suspended. His suspension eventually led to him getting fired overall. Unemployed, Dahmer met 25-year-old Joseph Bradhoft, I believe that's how you say his last name, who was a father of 3. While the two were at the apartment, Dahmer strangled the man to death. The body was left on the bed for a couple days, which allowed maggots to grow. Since maggots were growing, the body was cut into pieces and his head was left in the freezer. So far, most of Dahmer's victims were black and gay. As their families filed missing reports, they felt as if the police didn't care about their whereabouts because of their skin color and sexuality. As for me, I am a born-again Christian. I don't agree with the lifestyle. Despite my beliefs on homosexuality, homosexuals are still human beings. If they go missing, the police should be doing everything in their power to find out where they are or what happened to them. Dahmer did later explain how these killings weren't racially motivated. He explained that he targeted people he found attractive. Once again, that's his reason. Most definitely not a good reason to murder anybody. On July 22nd, 1991, Dahmer spotted 3 men, but 31-year-old Tracy Edwards was the one who Dahmer was attracted to the most. Dahmer offered all of them money, but Edwards was the only one who accepted the offer. As the two of them were at the apartment, Dahmer pressured Edwards to take off his clothes, offered a drink filled with drugs, but didn't take it because the whole situation seemed sketchy to him. At first, Dahmer was friendly to the man. That friendly attitude switched off, then Edwards began to smell this acid, and he saw the gallon as well, and when he wanted to leave, Dahmer handcuffed this dude. With Edwards handcuffed, Dahmer pulled a knife on him, listened in on Edwards' beating heart, then threatened to eat it. Eventually, Edwards was able to free himself, hit Dahmer, and ran out of the apartment. Edwards immediately spotted police and explained everything he just went through. At first, the police weren't too sure of his story, which I believe was not the right thing to do. If the police hear someone asking for help, they should definitely check out the situation. As they were outside of the apartment door, Dahmer invited the police and Edwards in as if nothing happened. While they were inside, Dahmer did admit that the story about the handcuffs were true, but didn't explain why, which in my opinion should have been sketchy to the cops. The police remembered the story Edwards said about the knife. As they were going to look into the bedroom, Dahmer did his best to keep them away from there. Obviously, this raised suspicion, but the police checked the bedroom anyway. Inside, they did find the knife. Not only that, but they found pictures of the cut bodies, which I'm sure freaked them out. I'm sure the police, saw crazy things on a daily basis, but I'm sure this case was unlike anything they've ever seen. When checking the fridge, one of the cops spotted the dead body parts and couldn't help but scream. There are 4 heads in the kitchen, and the rest of the body parts were found in the fridge and other parts in the house. Of course, after finding all of this in the apartment, they arrested Dahmer. After the arrest and taking stuff out from the apartment for evidence, it definitely caught the neighbors' attention. They were all shocked and horrified by it all. Eventually, what Dahmer did was all over the media, and there were even protests after the coverage because of what he did. Because of this coverage, Edwards was known as this hero. This didn't last long because this caught Mississippi's attention. You see, Mississippi had a warrant out for Edwards' arrest for sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl. He was eventually arrested and charged for the crime. The authorities had these bodies which they needed to identify, and they were able to discover who the unidentifiable ones were through dental records. With the families being notified, certain neighbors would explain how the families questioned how they couldn't know what was going on. Yes, I understand the families were hurting. Dahmer not only killed their loved ones, but prevented them by giving the victims a proper burial. They would forever live with the fact that Dahmer cut them in pieces, disposed of them, and even consumed them. Dahmer did confess his crimes to the two detectives investigating his case, Detectives Murphy and Kennedy, who were mortified by what Dahmer did after doing a 60-hour interview, discovering that he killed 17 people. He explained that he wanted to keep the skulls as some memorial altar or something like that to remember the victims' appearances. Eventually, Dahmer was charged with 15 counts of murder in Wisconsin and 1 in Ohio. He couldn't be charged with Stephen Tuomi's death since he couldn't remember killing the man, and the prosecutors didn't want to charge him beyond a reasonable doubt. Surprisingly, he wasn't charged with Edwards' attempted murder. Yeah, Edwards was a creep, but attempting to kill him is still illegal last time I checked. Dahmer was placed in protective custody with a $1 million bail. On January 30th, 1992, Dahmer pleaded guilty, but claimed schizophrenia and necrophilia. I absolutely hate defenses like this because there are people who actually suffer from mental illness who would never do the heinous acts which Dahmer has done. The prosecution concluded that Dahmer was sane and evil since he knew exactly what he did to the victims. On February 15th, 1992, the jury also saw Dahmer as sane and guilty. Dahmer was given 15 life sentences, which meant he was given a 957-year prison sentence. The families of the victims gave emotional, honest, and heavy statements. He was to serve his sentence in the Columbia Correctional Institution. On May 1st, 1992, Dahmer was extradited to Ohio for Hicks's murder trial. This didn't take long, only lasted for 45 minutes, and he was given his 16th life term, which gave him a 999-year prison sentence. In his first year, Dahmer was placed in solitary confinement because this prison was filled with gangsters, rapists, and serial killers who most likely wanted him dead. During this time in solitary confinement, he was granted TV and book access, which I don't think he should have had. The families of these victims were out there suffering, yet they made prison for him as comfortable as possible. Here's something which I believe must have caused controversy to this day. In July of 1994, Dahmer crossed paths with a preacher, in prison, named Roy Ratcliffe. Roy Ratcliffe would go to prison and minister to inmates, I believe. So this preacher did share the gospel of Jesus Christ with Dahmer, and by what Ratcliffe has said, Dahmer became a born-again Christian. Like I mentioned before, I'm a born-again Christian myself. I believe that God sent his perfect son, Jesus Christ, to die on the cross for the sins of all mankind. I do believe that when someone acknowledges their sin and acknowledges that the penalty of those sins would be an eternity in hell, someone has the choice to repent of those sins and ask Jesus Christ alone to save them. I got saved when I was 11 years old, and though Dahmer has done demonic, gruesome, sick, and twisted, heinous crimes, Jesus died for those sins too. And he wouldn't have turned Dahmer away if Dahmer truly did repent of his evil sins and trust in Jesus as his Savior. The Bible says in Romans 10:13, "But whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved." Whosoever means whosoever, anybody. Everyone in this earth has sinned, but no one is bad enough that when they trust in Jesus alone to save them, he won't turn them away if they are truly repentant. Once again, Roy Ratcliffe is the one who has stated that Dahmer became a born-again Christian before his death. He even stated how Dahmer would question if he was sinning by staying alive because of this guilt he had for doing what he did to his victims. Later on in July of 1994, inmate Osvaldo Dorothy cut Dahmer with a handmade knife, but didn't succeed in killing him. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was responsible at the time to clean bathrooms. With him were inmates Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. For some reason, these 3 were left unsupervised to work in the bathroom. Later on, Dahmer was discovered with a serious head and facial wounds at 8:10 a.m. What occurred was that Scarver, who hated white people and had history with mental health issues, hit Dahmer with a 20-inch metal bar. He was still alive but was rushed to the hospital. Anderson was hit too but died 2 days later. When Dahmer arrived to the hospital, he died an hour later. With the death of the serial killer, people were celebrating, and of course the victims' families celebrated as well. If it was true that Dahmer became a Christian, then it wouldn't have mattered to people. He would always be remembered as this gruesome serial killer. Like, he didn't spend his time on earth, doing great things for the Lord. Instead, he took this time on earth to just go out and kill and do heinous things to people's dead bodies. Joyce, Dahmer's mother, was angered after the death of her son. She expressed her anger with these words: "Now is everyone happy? Now that he's bludgeoned to death, is that good enough for everyone?" In Dahmer's will, he didn't want a funeral service. He wanted to be cremated, and he was. Later on in 2018, Scarver claimed in an interview that Dahmer was never sorry for his crimes. Not sure if this was before or after this conversion, which was discussed. He claimed Dahmer would taunt prisoners with forming prison food as body parts and ketchup as blood. He even claimed that the prison guards shared responsibility since they wanted Dahmer dead. This is one claim which I could believe. Like, this was a prison filled with dangerous individuals. Why would you leave any inmates unsupervised at all? Guess we'll never know if that's true or not. Thank you guys for taking the time in your day to watch this video. Like I've already mentioned, this had to be one of the craziest cases I've ever looked into. If you've got any thoughts on what was discussed, please share your thoughts in the comment section. If you'd like to have me cover a certain true crime case, please message me. I'll see y'all next week for True Crime Tuesdays. Take care, and I'll talk to y'all later.